Hi, I'm Mike Daly, editor of Adotas, and we're having a chat today with Alex Rowland, president of Alphabird, a vertically integrated audience development and content monetization company. How are you doing today, Alex?
Hey, Mike, how's it going?
Very well. How's the marketplace changing for publishers today, and what do you think lies ahead?
Well, I think it's actually a very interesting time for publishers. It's obviously been a very difficult last 2 or 3 years. If you look at a lot of the larger publishers, these are typically guys who have fairly substantial analog businesses, whether it's either in print or broadcast. And I think especially the print guys have started to see some very substantial changes in terms of what the revenue picture looks like for these guys and how their cost structures need to change. And I think that's indicative of a broader trend that's going on right now. If you look at kind of the statistics, for every $13 that they're losing in their analog businesses, they're only picking up about $1 in digital. And this whole conversation around, exchanging analog dollars for digital pennies is, there's enough data now that I think that's starting to impact how they look at the world and how they need to start adapting. And I think the trends are, frankly, accelerating, and I think there's some other troubling signs for these guys. The first is that there's a lot of movement towards programmatic buying in RTB. And this type of data-driven exercise in buying and apportioning media is something that most publishers are simply not very used to, right? They're used to selling very large blocks of inventory months in advance over drinks, and that marketplace is changing. And I think most of these guys are just simply not very well prepared to look at how they can optimize it in that kind of environment. And number two is you've got things like mobile. 35% of many publishers' traffic has moved to mobile over the last couple of years. And that kind of shift is also causing them issues in that they don't really know how to monetize mobile at the same kind of rate they have all their other media channels. So I think they've got some very significant pressures around revenue and profit margins. And it's causing some difficulty, right? This recent announcement by the Daily Beast that they're looking to lay off a huge chunk of their editorial staff. There's this, I think, I wouldn't call it panic, but definite alarm on the parts of publishers as to how they deal with this whole situation. And I think the way we look at things here at Alphabird is that there's a way out of this, right? You look at folks like Huffington Post or BuzzFeed or Bleacher Report. These are publishers that frankly have thrived in this kind of environment. And I think that points to models that do actually work. And I think that part of the challenge that these guys have to face is how do we actually change our models without falling off a cliff in the process. And I think that involves becoming much more technology driven. And I think that'll be a challenge for some, but I think there's ways in which they can get around that. And I think they need to start looking at how they variabilize costs that are not core to they're not core differentiators. I think publishers need to sit down and say, what are we good at? Are we good at content? Are we good at sales? Are we good at technology? What are the things that really are going to allow us to thrive in this environment? And how do we take the other things that we're not so good at and get someone to help us out with those things?
How do you think mobile is going to impact digital publishers moving forward?
Well, like I said, mobile has been somewhere around 35% of the traffic for some of these publishers from almost zero even 2-3 years ago. So mobile is going to be significant in that it requires a very different approach. I think one of the problems with mobile is it's not just a matter of advertisers not spending enough money there yet. I mean, I think Mary Meeker came out with a report fairly recently where she was comparing the amount of time spent by consumers with the amount of proportionate money in the media ecosystem being spent on those channels. And things like print publications are massively outspent in terms of the amount of consumers' time that's spent there, whereas things like mobile are fairly de minimis right now, and that's always got to change. But even if that does change, I think things like cell phones are very difficult to monetize on. Display advertising is not very compelling on a mobile platform. I think you have new formats like native advertising that I think are going to be the future of that. I'll talk about in a second. But generally, mobile presents a very significant challenge in that it increases the costs for publishers. Now suddenly they can't simply look at their site and make a couple of modifications. They have to acknowledge that there's going to be a multitude of different systems they've got to interact with. And that's changing the way they have to design their sites, and reinvesting in substantial website design is something that a lot of these guys are not excited about spending money on right now. But on top of that, they've got to figure out how to monetize on this platform, because if they're seeing revenues decline right now and they're not seeing enough money come in from digital to fill this kind of analog hole, that problem is going to get a lot worse. And I think it's happening at a pace that is really catching a lot of these guys off guard. So mobile's a place I think publishers have to start looking at. How do we become a mobile-first publisher and web second? Because if they're not doing that now, they're going to have to do that within the next 2 years, and they may as well get used to doing that today.
Why do you think data matters so much to publishers?
Well, I think they're getting killed in the RTB marketplaces. I mean, you look at the decline in yields on things like display, and it's because you have these new marketplaces in which you have very sophisticated traders on the buy side who are using information to their significant advantage to identify very specific segments within a publisher's inventory that is massively undervalued. Companies like Criteo are taking advantage of this in a very substantial way, in many ways to their own benefit. But I think it speaks to the challenge the publishers have if they don't start to get a hold of how data impacts looking at things like segmentation and effective pricing. Again, I think the days of having very large blocks of inventory getting sold months in advance and segmenting it by this is homepage or this is run of site, that type of segmentation is simply not going to survive in the future. So I think publishers need to start saying, well, if we're going to actually participate and programmatic buying is a reality, I don't think we can avoid that, then we need to start using data the same way that the buy side does to inform how we segment our impressions and how we get the maximum possible price. Assigning a rate card to all of your impressions may be overvaluing many of those impressions, but it's probably undervaluing a lot of them as well. And the more that I think they can use data to flavor those decisions, the better. But I think on top of that, publishers need to understand that it's not just the ad that they need to use data to inform their decisions about. It's all of the content on the page. When a consumer gets to a page, the more information you have about that consumer, the better you're going to be at not just serving them an ad, but serving them other related content. How do you get them to spend more time in the site? How do you recommend other pieces of content, either within your own site or on other properties that you can then sell your audience to and generate new revenue sources? And that type of analysis, that type of utilization of data in marketing to new people, in making decisions about what content we serve on the page, all those things are just as critical in my mind to making sure they make money in this kind of data-rich environment.
You touched before a little bit on native advertising. How do you think that it's going to factor into the advertising ecosystem?
Well, it's funny, native advertising I think is, it's kind of a topic du jour. I think the funny thing for publishers is this is actually a very old model, right? The advertorial is something that's been around for a very long period of time. And this is, to me, a similar incarnation of that same kind of model. And I think there's a lot of positive signs right now from folks that are testing this, even at scale, people like Facebook and Twitter and the like, but even publishers, Forbes, The Atlantic, all these guys who are testing native ad platforms and started to try to roll that out at scale are seeing some relative success around that. There's two questions around that. One is whether this kind of improved performance will survive. When display ads first came out, they got very high CTRs, right? People really interacted with these things and felt engaged by advertising. Well, that picture has changed as people have seen more of it and become more immune to it. I think there's a risk over time that that same thing will happen to native. So I think a lot of the performance we see out of native ads right now is not what people can expect, 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. But I think a lot of the criticism of native advertising revolves around lack of scale. And I actually think that's misplaced. I think, I've seen quite a few different platforms emerge recently that act as native ad servers and are getting scale by being very innovative in terms of how they integrate with different CMS platforms. So I think that you can get scale out of native advertising. And ultimately, I think you're going to see a lot of people start to use data the same way they're using in display advertising and pre-roll advertising to flavor the types of native advertisements that get promoted. The problem is you just don't have enough liquidity in that market yet. There's not enough buyers and sellers. So I think it's very early on. I think it's a very promising way of marketing. I think it gets brands much more focused on producing compelling content as opposed to a static ad, which I think is very encouraging. I think it gets publishers much more focused on how they integrate advertising much more interactively into the content in a way that's much more organic for the audience. But I think the most compelling reason why native advertising is something that publishers need to focus on is the fact that mobile is going to be a very large chunk of their viewership. And mobile, I don't think, is going to get monetized very effectively with straight display ads. I mean, anytime I've seen a display ad on a cell phone, that's become the easiest thing for me to ignore. I don't even see those things anymore. It's just a reduction in my screen size. I feel like part of the reason why they increased the size of the iPhone the way they did is simply to make ads kind of disappear even further, right? So I think if you look at like mobile, native integration of advertising messaging, I think is the only way to really get scale and engagement from a mobile user. So I think it's going to be really, really critical for publishers to figure out how to get some scale out of that. But today there's not enough liquidity, but I think that will change over the next, call it 36 months.
What do brands and media companies have to learn from each other?
Well, I think it's funny, actually. Brands are becoming much more like media companies, and I think media companies have to start looking at the world much more like brands do. I mean, if you look at an Amazon, for example, they're a very sophisticated publisher. You look at people like Red Bull or DC Shoes, these guys producing great original content and aggregating huge amounts of audience. They are becoming publishers. So I think brands are starting to understand that by looking at the web as a giant on-demand platform, they need to start engaging consumers rather than simply interacting with them through some sort of interruptive mechanism. And I think that's very healthy. I think you're seeing some brands really take advantage of that. I think it's a very difficult thing. I think most brands are not used to being content companies, and I think that they don't really, in many cases, understand production and creative and distribution, a lot of things that really drive media companies. But I think they're getting better and better at it, and I think we're going to see that trend continue. But media companies, I think, have the opposite problem in that I think they're very, very good at content and creative and all those things. But some of the things that brands become very effective at using, things like data to inform the kind of content they produce and how they recommend content. And all these things are becoming core to the way in which brands operate. That needs to translate down to the media companies. They need to be able to look at the way in which Amazon creates a page, right? They're very, very good at getting me to buy something else. Content's the same thing. How do I get you to read more content and interact with me for a longer period of time? And I think they can take some lessons from people like Amazon in terms of how they use data and how they understand consumers to really do that in a more effective way. So I think you'll see kind of a merging of these two efforts and a lot of blurring of the lines between these two guys over the next kind of 5 years. And again, I think that's a very healthy thing. And I think especially given things like OTT and the movement towards, how people view internet content on their televisions. I think the way people used to look at it is like, oh, we're going to have what looks like a Windows desktop on their TVs. Well, obviously that's not really how things are evolving, right? I think it looks very, very different from that. But at the same time, I think brands are learning that if they're going to engage on those types of platforms, those types of on-demand platforms, content is the center of that ecosystem. The reason why I'm interacting with someone on my TV is I am very entertainment and content driven. And a lot of those guys, I think if they're simply relying on interstitial advertising, are going to have a much, much tougher time as that TV becomes more of an on-demand platform, getting the same kind of interaction with the consumers that they have through broadcast, where it's much more of a casual, lean-back kind of environment. So I think they have to get better and better at content and better at managing that kind of interaction. And that's where I think I could even see situations in which brands buy media companies in order to get better and better and kind of internalize that type of skill set.
We've been talking with Alex Rowland, president of Alphabird. Alex, thanks very much for taking the time to sit down with us today.
Mike, I really appreciate it.
This is Mike Daly, editor of Adotas. Thanks for watching.